Hey, thanks for pressing play on this episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at my favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm your host, Tom Browning. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in, and welcome to the 11th episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. I'm your host, Tom Browning. Today, I would like to profile one of the greatest left wingers in New York Rangers history. As a matter of fact, he is the highest scoring left wing ever to lace him up for the New York Rangers. And that is number 8, Steve Vickers, also known as Sarge by his teammates when he played for the Rangers for 10 years, from 1972 to 1982. Steve Vickers was drafted in the first round, the 10th selection by the New York Rangers in the NHL Amateur Draft, in a draft that saw the likes of Guy Lafleur, Marcel Dion, 2 future Hall of Famers. Also a solid franchise defenseman in Jocelyn Gavermont for the Vancouver Canucks. And also a player that was drafted by the St. Louis Blues number 1, became a future New York Ranger, but a player that never lived up to the promise, that the skill set that he brought to the team, and that is Gene Carr. But again, this program is about Steve Vickers. And Steve Vickers was a very successful junior hockey player with the Toronto Marlboros, an all-star right winger who was as tough as they came, who had a tremendous shot, especially his backhand shot, which he later went on to perfect with the New York Rangers. But Steve Vickers brought an element to the New York Rangers during the 1972 season that they hadn't had in a long time. As a matter of fact, in the 1972 season, Steve Vickers, despite missing 3 weeks and almost 20 games, earned the Calder Trophy as the NHL Rookie of the Year when he scored 30 goals. And again, despite missing 3 weeks. And he also was the first Ranger to win the Rookie of the Year since, I believe it was 1954, when Emile Henry won the award. So the Rangers had gone a long period of time without a top-notch, dominant rookie to earn consideration for the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year. But Steve Vickers did not disappoint. The Rangers needed a guy who could play tough down low, who was really an immovable object in front of the goalie. And when time came to have to drop the gloves, was able to do so to defend his teammates, to defend the honor of the New York Rangers. And Steve Vickers brought all that to the New York Rangers starting in 1972. His first 4 seasons, he scored over 30 goals. His rookie year, people forget, he actually was the first NHL player to score back-to-back hat tricks. No NHL player, despite all the great scorers in NHL history, no NHL player had actually scored back-to-back hat tricks, and he accomplished this all in his rookie season. So Steve Vickers came on the scene with great fanfare with the New York Rangers. And I'll never forget, I believe it was February of 1973, so it was the second half of his rookie season, when the Rangers played a very important game against the Boston Bruins in Boston Garden. And, I've said this before on many of my earlier podcasts. The Rangers were a team highly skilled, yet they always had trouble against the physical teams. And again, this was still the case during the 1973 season, 72-73 season, with the likes of the Boston Bruins and the Philadelphia Flyers always taking the Rangers hard, playing them physical. And the Rangers very seldom had an answer. But in this particular game in Boston Garden, the Rangers played lights out against the Bruins. And it was a fight between Steve Vickers after the Rangers had just scored a goal. I believe it was Walt Tkaczuk who had just scored a goal against Eddie Johnston of the Boston Bruins. And Steve Vickers got tangled up with tough guy Don Marcotte of the Boston Bruins. Now I say tough guy, the Bruins were loaded with tough guys. Terry O'Reilly, Don Marcotte, Wayne Cashman, Ken Hodge. But Don Marcotte was he was an aggravating player. And he challenged Steve Vickers. And Steve Vickers knocked him out with a right hand, a TKO, which really bolstered the Rangers for the rest of the season. It really catapulted the Rangers, gained them a lot of confidence. As history will show, they actually went on and beat the Boston Bruins in the playoffs. One of the few times the Rangers ever beat the Bruins in the playoffs during the spring of 1973. And many Ranger players point to that game at the Boston Garden in February when Steve Vickers, a mere rookie, took on Don Marcotte and TKO'd Don Marcotte in that most important fight. The Rangers won that game, and as I mentioned, went on to beat the Boston Bruins in the playoffs that year. But Steve Vickers was not a guy that started fights. As a matter of fact, as a New York Ranger fan, I kind of wish he maybe started a few more, especially in games where the Rangers really needed some energy, really needed to take the initiative against the teams like the Philadelphia Flyers and the Boston Bruins. But Steve Vickers was not that type of player. He was not one to start fights. But As a former scout of the New York Rangers would say, he never started the fights, he only finished them. And he would go on to have a great career as a goal scorer and also as a fighter. But it was very rare that Steve Vickers would ever start a fight. He would only finish them. And he was a very, very tough hockey player. He was part of the Bulldog Line, the famous Bulldog Line, Walt, Tkaczuk, Billy Fairbairn. And preceding Steve Vickers, the early stages of the Bulldog Line had Davey Ballon, another former NHL All-Star who had won 2 Stanley Cups with the Montreal Canadiens. And he's a player I would probably like to profile down the road as well. Dave Ballon was a very highly skilled player who later succumbed, unfortunately, to MS, which not only took his life, but also shortened his career and impacted his career toward the latter part of his tenure with the New York Rangers, his second stint with the Rangers. But Dave Ballon, Walt, Tkaczuk, and Billy Fairbairn started the Bulldog Line, one of the toughest two-way hockey lines in NHL history. And Steve Vickers fit right into the Bulldog Line after Dave Ballon was traded. Steve Vickers was the finisher. Walt, Tkaczuk, Billy Fairbairn, they were the hard-working center icemen and right wingers who would dig the puck out, play top-notch defense, and Steve Vickers would park himself right in his office. His office, as a left winger, remember, he was a right winger in junior hockey, but Emile Francis converted him to left wing. And he was stationed to the right-hand side of the goalie, right in the crease. That was his office. Like Phil Esposito with the Boston Bruins, Steve Vickers' office was right to the right on the doorstep of the goalie. And Steve Vickers was tough down low. He wasn't a great skater, but he had tremendous balance. And he was able to park himself despite taking a beating from opposing National Hockey League defensemen. He would not give an inch. He was an immovable object. And again, he wasn't that big. He was about 6 feet tall, 185 pounds, but very, very strong. And most of his goals came down low on rebounds. And as I stated earlier, he perfected his backhand shot in junior hockey. And he had one of the most accurate backhand shots in the National Hockey League. And he scored a lot of his backhands on rebounds off of shots by Tkaczuk, Fairbairn, Brad Park from the point, and other New York Rangers. Now, later on in his career, after Vic Hadfield was traded, Steve Vickers did spend some time on the goal of game line with Jean Rattel and Raj Gilbert. But for the most part, he made his following. His success came with the Bulldog Line, one of the top-notch two-way lines during the 1970s. They could check, they could play it tough, and they could score goals. Walt, Tkaczuk, Billy Fairbairn, Steve Vickers, one of the greatest lines, never the number one line. They were one of the greatest lines in National Hockey League history, and of course, in New York Rangers history. Now, Steve Vickers, as I mentioned before, scored over 30 goals, his first 4 seasons. And he had, I believe it was his third year, he scored 41 goals. I believe it was 89 points. He led the Rangers in points that particular season. But he also scored 29 goals the year that the Rangers went to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Montreal Canadiens. It was a year that was very gratifying to Vickers because preceding that 1979 year, I can't say he fell into disfavor, but his role was minimized when Emile Francis left the New York Rangers and when John Ferguson, Jean-Guy Talbot, and Fred Shero began coaching the Rangers during the latter part of the 1970s. But he did have a comeback year in 1979 when Fred Shero was the coach, and he scored 29 goals playing to the left of Phil Esposito as a left winger for a large part during that season with Anders Hedberg, Phil Esposito, and Steve Vickers. And again, they took the Montreal Canadiens to the 5th game of the Stanley Cup Finals. Unfortunately, it was the very next year that Steve Vickers started his decline with the New York Rangers, and Herb Brooks and Craig Patrick, who at the time were the coach and GM of the New York Rangers, they sent him down to Springfield of the American Hockey League, and Steve Vickers decided after 10 prosperous, productive years in the National Hockey League that he had had enough. But Steve Vickers was a very important player for the New York Rangers. He brought a toughness that was sorely lacking with the team. But he could also play. And again, he'll go down, he still is today, the highest scoring left winger in New York Rangers history. And there was another highlight to his career. He made 2 All-Star teams, by the way, in 75 and 76. And he was also a second team NHL All-Star. So he also had the accolades. But in 1979, the year that he the year he came back with the 29-goal season and went to the Stanley Cup Finals, he had an unheard of almost 30% shooting percentage, which is unheard of in the National Hockey League. He led the NHL in shooting percentage the year he scored 29 goals in 1979. And he also holds the Ranger record for most points in a game, where he scored 7 points against Ron Lowe and the Washington Capitals. So Steve Vickers has had his game reel highlights, but he brought toughness. He was a quiet leader. And again, Pete Tkaczuk gave him the nickname of Sarge because he always wore an old Army jacket to practice every day. And Pete Tkaczuk, who was known for his glib one-liners, his sense of humor, bestowed that nickname onto Steve Vickers. I believe it was his rookie year, and the name stuck throughout his tenure with the Rangers and continues today. So it was a real pleasure watching Steve Vickers play. And he was one of the few Rangers that would collect, in quotes, those garbage goals. But it was his toughness in front of the net, his ability to score on rebounds, the immovable object, that tremendous backhand shot, that high shooting percentage, the quick hands that he had, and the ability to defend himself and his teammates that will always make Steve Vickers one of the all-time favorites for New York Rangers fans. And he really is a forgotten hero of Broadway. It would be nice to see the Rangers recognize him more, and a few other players, as I talked about in past broadcasts, and I'll feature going forward. But Steve Vickers was a top-notch player, a tough left winger, highest scoring left winger in New York Rangers history. So that concludes my 11th episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, focusing on number 8, Steve Vickers. I would like to get feedback from all of you as to what New York Ranger players you would like for me to focus on going forward. Again, I'd like to focus on players from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, players that were stars, important players during their particular tenure with the Rangers, but really are forgotten today. You don't read much about, you don't hear much about. And maybe the New York Rangers organization have not brought them into the fold or spend much time discussing their heroics from earlier decades. But drop me a line on my email, and drop me a line on the website. Also, if you'd like to subscribe, please do that on iTunes or on YouTube. And look forward to our next episode on the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Go Tommy Boy production.